April 3rd, 1965. 11:42 p.m. Harlem was quiet in the way only a neighborhood aware of its own danger can be. Inside a dim back room on 135th Street, a man slid a single photograph across the table. No shouting, no gun, just paper and a number written in red ink. 7 days. That was all Bumpy Johnson had. 7 days to respond before secrets spilled, alliances shattered, and his control of Harlem risked unraveling in an instant. The photograph was old, yet precise, showing ledgers, coded names, routes, and evidence only someone close to the operation could have obtained. Bumpy did not flinch. He did not yell. He stared at the photo, his mind already calculating, plotting, waiting. Outside, the city slept, unaware that the most dangerous man in Harlem faced a threat unlike any other. Not bullets, not rivals, but leverage. By the end of the week, one man would vanish, one empire would bend, and the entire city would learn that trying to blackmail Bumpy Johnson was a gamble no one survived. By the mid-1960s, Harlem was more than a neighborhood, it was a battlefield. The streets thrummed with the quiet pulse of money moving through barber shops, record stores, and back rooms. Millions circulating daily, invisible to banks and untouched by law. At the center of it all was Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson, now 59, freshly out of prison, but sharper, more calculating than ever. The Italians dominated downtown, controlling docks and legitimate businesses, while the Irish held sway over shipping and warehouses. But Harlem was Bumpy's domain, a territory he protected with the precision of a chess master rather than the recklessness of a thug. He had survived decades of war, betrayals, and murder, and the men around him knew one thing. Challenging him meant playing a game where he already knew all the moves. His power was not rooted in sheer violence, but in timing, organization, and the fear of those who underestimated him. Every operator paid on schedule, every rule was enforced, and every alliance, particularly with the Italian families, was carefully maintained. Yet the balance of power was fragile. Federal eyes were everywhere, informants whispered in dark corners, and younger crews hungrier than ever were testing limits. They wanted fast money, fast respect, fast chaos, and somewhere in that hunger, someone made a fatal error. They assumed that Bumpy's age, his time behind bars, or Harlem's shifting landscape made him vulnerable. They did not understand that patience, strategy, and observation were his weapons. Blackmail, the oldest and most subtle tool of power, had entered his world. It was designed to corner him, force a hasty mistake, or expose his empire to scrutiny. What they failed to realize was that Bumpy Johnson did not react with panic. He calculated, he waited, and in 7 days, he would turn their own game against them. Harlem would remain intact, the threat dissolved, and the lesson for New York would be written without a single gunshot. Day one began quietly, almost deceptively so. Harlem's streets hummed with the familiar rhythm of the night. Numbers runners weaving through alleys, the faint clatter of carts on cobblestones, the low murmur of men collecting debts, as though nothing had changed. But Bumpy Johnson, sitting in his usual booth at Wells' restaurant, knew better. He was 59, recently paroled, yet every line of his face spoke of decades surviving the underworld. The photograph that had arrived days earlier rested in his mind like a shadow, and he understood immediately. This was not a random threat. The ledger, the coded names, the exact routes, someone close, someone with intimate knowledge of his operations, had dared to challenge him. He drank his coffee slowly, the dark liquid warming him as he observed the room around him, watching the barber leave for the next client, seeing the subtle nods of recognition from familiar faces. Day one passed without action, but Bumpy was already moving unseen. Runners were reassigned, collection routes subtly altered, couriers delayed intentionally. These minor shifts were invisible to most, but they were bait, a test to see who would make the first mistake. The men behind the blackmail were watching, confident, expecting panic. By evening, a mid-level operator, Calvin Morris, 34, ambitious and impulsive, questioned why his usual route had changed. He had no idea the shift was deliberate. His curiosity marked him, and Bumpy logged it mentally. On day two, whispers reached one of Bumpy's Italian contacts downtown. Someone in Harlem was shopping information, testing the waters. It was a controlled leak. Bumpy allowed it to spread just enough to draw the right reactions, to identify the weak links. By day 3, a man named Raymond Ellis, 41, a fixer who had long bridged the gaps between crews, requested a direct meeting without going through channels. It was a mistake. Ellis spoke carefully, mentioning federal attention casually, hinting at pressure in Harlem, probing for Bumpy's reaction. Bumpy listened, asked nothing, paid for the drinks, and sent him on his way. That evening, Harlem seemed unchanged, yet the balance had already shifted. Bumpy's enemies had revealed themselves through impatience and overconfidence, and the clock he had set was already counting down. Day 4 brought subtle escalations. A courier hesitated. A young runner repeated a name incorrectly. A new rumor surfaced in the cafes along 135th Street. Bumpy noted each discrepancy, each deviation. His empire was still intact, but the edges were fraying for those who had misjudged him. By day 5, the blackmailers were desperate. They expected visible fear, a counteroffer, or a hasty move. Bumpy offered none. Harlem continued its rhythm. Payments were collected. Debts settled. Meetings occurred. Yet behind that calm, a precise recalibration of power had already taken place. By day 6, the enemy moved recklessly. A meeting was arranged at a warehouse by the river, supposedly neutral ground. Bumpy did not attend. He had anticipated the play. His Italian allies, informed quietly and with precision, went instead. Ledgers were compared, stories dissected, and contradictions surfaced. Panic began to seep into the blackmailers' ranks, though still unnoticed by outsiders. Day 7 arrived like a calm before a storm that had already passed. No dramatic confrontation. No public display. A single payphone call, carefully controlled, marked the end. The blackmail was over. Not because Bumpy paid, not because he threatened, but because those who had tried to leverage information had exposed themselves, one by one, and none remained capable of collecting on their threat. Harlem returned to its rhythm, the lesson indelibly etched into its streets. Never misjudge Bumpy Johnson. Day 8 did not exist in calendars, but in the minds of those who had tried to challenge Bumpy Johnson, the repercussions of the week reverberated as though time itself had folded. Harlem's streets moved like a well-oiled machine, the surface calm concealing the undercurrents of fear, uncertainty, and the quiet calculation that only Bumpy could inspire. Calvin Morris, once confident and ambitious, now moved through the neighborhood as though every shadow could conceal a threat. His communication slowed, his steps measured, his pride stripped without a single blow to his body. The men behind the blackmail, those who had believed themselves clever, watched from safe houses and anonymous offices downtown, unaware that their moves had already been anticipated, cataloged, and neutralized. Bumpy understood that patience was a weapon more lethal than any gun. By not reacting, by allowing the world to operate as usual, he forced his enemies to reveal themselves through mistakes, oversights, and overconfidence. Each misstep became another piece of the puzzle, every careless remark a thread he could pull to unravel their schemes. On this second phase of the operation, the structure of his empire remained flawless on the surface, but below, subtle realignments occurred. Bumpy had always known that in crime, information was both shield and sword. Here, he wielded it expertly. By day 9, whispers circulated among rival crews that something was off, though no one could articulate what. Men were disappearing from conversation, names erased, influence quietly neutralized. The blackmailers, who had thought themselves clever, discovered too late that each move they made had been anticipated, that every attempt to intimidate had played directly into Bumpy's hands. By the end of this phase, every participant had internalized a singular truth. Bumpy Johnson's mind was the deadliest weapon in Harlem, and 7 days of silent maneuvering could achieve what bullets and violence could not. By day 11, the city outside Harlem remained oblivious, but inside, the pulse of fear and precision was palpable to those who had dared to challenge Bumpy Johnson. The blackmailers, once confident in their carefully gathered information, now moved with hesitancy that betrayed their own understanding of being outmaneuvered. Bumpy's strategy was simple in appearance yet profoundly intricate. Allow the enemy to act, observe every choice, anticipate missteps, and ensure that no single thread could escape his notice. The couriers who had once run the streets without thought were now subtly repositioned. Those with too much curiosity found their roles quietly diminished, and entire communication channels were monitored without their knowledge. Harlem's operators paid attention, not to Bumpy's movements, but to the shifts in routine, the delayed deliveries, the unexpected absences, the subtle changes in collection patterns that indicated a silent recalibration of power. By the middle of the week, the blackmailers began turning on one another, suspicious of leaks, unsure who could be trusted. Friends became threats in whispers. Alliances that had seemed unshakable eroded under the weight of unseen observation. On day 12, Raymond Ellis made a move he would soon regret, arranging an unsanctioned meeting to consolidate the information and pressure a junior operator into cooperation. Bumpy, of course, never attended. Instead, his trusted Italian allies were positioned nearby, ready to witness, report, and subtly influence the outcome without revealing their presence. The meeting collapsed before it truly began, leaving Ellis exposed and impotent, his credibility crumbling, and the leverage he had sought rendered meaningless. By day 13, the surviving blackmailers found themselves isolated, confused, and powerless. No threats, no warnings, no overt violence. Yet the effect was total. Each man understood, without a word spoken directly, that they had underestimated the intelligence, patience, and foresight of Bumpy Johnson. Meanwhile, Harlem itself moved uninterrupted, as though nothing had happened, yet the streets carried an unspoken respect, a quiet acknowledgement of the man who controlled not through brute force, but through calculated strategy. By the end of day 14, 7 days had passed since the initial photograph arrived, and the lesson had been fully delivered. In Bumpy Johnson's world, time, observation, and controlled patience were more lethal than any gun. Harlem would remember the week quietly, its rhythm uninterrupted but its lessons indelibly marked. And Bumpy Johnson remained seated at Wells' restaurant, sipping his coffee, untouched, victorious, having turned what was meant to be a threat into proof of his enduring, unassailable control over the streets he had protected for decades. The climax of the 7-day ordeal was not announced with gunfire or sirens. It unfolded quietly, almost imperceptibly, as though the city itself held its breath while the pieces moved into place. By the morning of the 7th day, Raymond Ellis, the fixer who had once believed himself untouchable, had vanished from the streets of Harlem. No one saw him leave, and no one reported him missing in any official capacity. He was alive, perhaps, but his influence, credibility, and connections had been quietly erased. Calvin Morris, the ambitious mid-level operator, found his network dismantled. Friends, informants, and junior runners he had once relied upon disappeared or went silent. The blackmailers had assumed that information could dominate Bumpy Johnson the way money or bullets could, but they had underestimated the one weapon he had wielded his entire life: patience. From his seat at Wells' restaurant, Bumpy observed Harlem with the practiced calm of a man who had survived decades of treachery, imprisonment, and constant threats. He had allowed the enemy to reveal their own weaknesses. Their movements, conversations, and minor errors had all been cataloged, analyzed, and leveraged without a single overt action on his part. By the evening, the Italians who had long shared business arrangements with him downtown were quietly informed of what had transpired. They were not instructed to act with violence, but to recognize the new balance of power. The blackmailers, convinced of their cleverness, were left to navigate the consequences of their own overconfidence. They had anticipated fear, intimidation, and perhaps a desperate counteroffer, but none of it came. Instead, Harlem moved with its usual rhythm, the subtle manipulations invisible to anyone not trained to see them. Bumpy had not reacted. He had observed, adjusted, and allowed the clock to dictate the outcome. The realization slowly dawned on anyone paying attention. A man could control an entire city with silence, observation, and foresight. By nightfall, the week that had begun with a simple photograph and a single number, 7 days, had concluded. The threat was neutralized. Lives had been altered without violence. Lessons had been learned, reputations altered, and the streets of Harlem carried the weight of an unspoken truth. Bumpy Johnson did not need to fire a gun to win. His mind had already done the work, and in the quiet of that 7th day, the city understood that the most dangerous man in New York wielded information and patience as lethal weapons. No one dared underestimate him again. The final hours of the Blackmail ordeal were marked not by chaos, but by silence, a silence that carried more weight than any gunshot could. Those who had attempted to manipulate Bumpy Johnson through threats and stolen information now realized the futility of their actions. The men who had believed themselves clever were left exposed, isolated, and powerless. Their meetings had been observed, their moves anticipated, and their strategies dismantled without Bumpy ever leaving his seat at Wells' restaurant. The ledger, once a weapon against him, had been absorbed into his empire, its secrets neutralized through control and foresight. Harlem streets moved as if nothing had occurred, yet every operator, every runner, and every rival knew, in the unspoken language of respect and fear, that the balance of power had shifted irrevocably. Bumpy's Italian allies, informed quietly, reinforced this lesson without a single violent confrontation. Meanwhile, the blackmailers' reputations crumbled. Some vanished entirely, their credibility gone. Others survived, but found their influence irreparably diminished. By the conclusion of the seventh day, Bumpy Johnson had turned what was intended as a threat into proof of his unparalleled strategic genius. He had demonstrated that patience, observation, and the precise manipulation of time could achieve what bullets, intimidation, or brute force could not. The city, unaware of the intricate maneuvers that had transpired behind closed doors, sensed only the outcome. The most dangerous man in Harlem had not been challenged, but had dominated silently. In the quiet aftermath, the neighborhood operated normally, yet the invisible lesson lingered, an indelible warning to anyone foolish enough to underestimate Bumpy Johnson. The blackmail attempt never made the papers, and that is precisely what made it so significant. History often remembers the loud, the violent, and the spectacular, but true power leaves subtle marks, felt rather than seen. Over 7 days, Bumpy Johnson had demonstrated a mastery that few could comprehend, a command over events that did not require the flash of a gun or the public display of dominance. Harlem moved as it always did, rhythms uninterrupted, but behind the scenes, the lesson was unforgettable. Those who had believed they could manipulate him had exposed themselves, not through confrontation, but through their own errors and miscalculations. Bumpy observed, waited, and allowed the sequence of events to unfold according to a plan that existed only in his mind. By not reacting, he forced his enemies to act in ways that revealed their vulnerabilities, their impatience, and their lack of understanding of true power. He had taken information, the most dangerous currency in the world of crime, and neutralized it without confrontation. Every operator, every runner, every ally who watched him during this week could see the lesson being imparted, even if they did not yet understand the full scope. The subtle recalibration of routes, the quiet repositioning of trusted men, the careful observation of every movement, all demonstrated an intelligence that extended beyond violence and fear. By the end of the week, the blackmailers were left not dead, but diminished, their networks compromised, their confidence shattered. Bumpy did not seek revenge, for revenge is reactive, and he had never been reactive in his life. He was strategic, patient, calculating, and in those qualities lay the lesson for Harlem, for New York, and for anyone who believed that information alone could unseat a man who understood the mechanics of power. The week had proven something far more profound than control over territory or money. It had proven that the strongest weapon is not visible to the untrained eye. It is the mind of a man who has lived, observed, and survived against every threat imaginable. And Bumpy Johnson's mind had, once again, shown that it was untouchable, invincible, and lethal in its quiet efficiency. As the dust settled over Harlem, the reality of what had transpired slowly sank in for those who had attempted the blackmail. They had come armed with knowledge, thinking it would be enough to bend Bumpy Johnson to their will. But knowledge without understanding is a dangerous illusion. Bumpy had observed their methods, predicted their impatience, and let their own errors dismantle their influence. What outsiders saw as a calm, routine week was, in reality, a masterclass in strategic manipulation. He had turned every attempt against him into an advantage, every whisper into a weapon, and every misstep into proof of his superiority. The psychological impact of his silent dominance rippled through the streets, shaping behavior without a single confrontation. Operators who once tested limits now acted with caution. Runners became more disciplined. Even rival factions acknowledged, quietly and indirectly, that Bumpy Johnson's reach extended beyond the visible streets of Harlem. By allowing the blackmailers to believe they controlled the narrative, he had achieved a far greater victory than any overt act of violence could have provided. The streets retained their rhythm, but the hierarchy had shifted subtly, irrevocably, and without the need for bloodshed. This lesson, unspoken but understood, emphasized that intelligence, patience, and foresight are far more powerful than brute force. Those who had attempted the blackmail were left to reckon with the consequences of their own overconfidence. Their reputations were diminished, their networks fractured, and their credibility eroded. Harlem's residents may never have known the full story, but the effects were evident in the changed behavior of operators and allies alike. Bumpy's methodical approach ensured that control was maintained, threats neutralized, and respect secured. In these 7 days, he had rewritten the rules of engagement in the underworld, proving that the mind, when applied with precision and patience, could dominate a city more effectively than any army or arsenal. For Bumpy Johnson, power was not measured in fear or gunfire, but in the ability to orchestrate events invisibly, leaving adversaries undone without ever needing to reveal the hand that guided them. In the days following the blackmail attempt, the streets of Harlem returned to their familiar rhythm, but beneath the surface, the aftereffects of Bumpy Johnson's actions were undeniable. Operators who had once moved boldly through the neighborhood now exercised caution, aware that every step, every decision, and every whisper could be observed and countered. The blackmailers, still licking the wounds of their miscalculations, were forced into irrelevance, their networks dismantled without a single violent confrontation. Bumpy's genius lay not in the use of force, but in the orchestration of perception. He had transformed fear into a silent ally, allowing his enemies to undermine themselves while Harlem continued its daily operations, unaware of the invisible chessboard on which their fates had been decided. Even the Italians, longtime business partners who understood the precarious balance of power, observed in quiet admiration, recognizing that Bumpy's ability to maneuver without confrontation was far more dangerous than any overt act of aggression. The lesson resonated beyond those directly involved. Whispers of his methodical brilliance spread throughout the underworld, cautioning rivals and reinforcing loyalty among allies. Bumpy had proven that in a world defined by secrecy, betrayal, and constant threats, intelligence and patience were the ultimate instruments of dominance. Over the 7 days, he had demonstrated that control was not maintained through intimidation alone, but through anticipation, observation, and the strategic manipulation of every variable at play. The blackmailers had believed they held leverage, yet they failed to account for a mind that had survived decades of warfare, betrayal, and law enforcement scrutiny. Their errors were magnified by his foresight, and their failures served as a warning to anyone who might consider challenging him in the future. Harlem, though outwardly unchanged, now operated under an invisible hierarchy reinforced not by fear of violence, but by fear of miscalculation. Every operator, every runner, every observer understood, whether consciously or not, that Bumpy Johnson's influence extended beyond the visible, and that attempting to manipulate him carried consequences far beyond immediate perception. 7 days had tested his patience, skill, and strategic insight, and by the end, he had emerged unscathed, his control absolute, and his reputation as Harlem's most formidable figure sealed beyond dispute. By the end of the week, the blackmail attempt had evolved into a quiet legend within Harlem's underworld. Bumpy Johnson, seated in Wells' restaurant, sipping his coffee as if nothing had occurred, had orchestrated a flawless neutralization of a threat without firing a single shot. The men who had tried to manipulate him were left diminished, their influence shattered, and their reputations tarnished beyond repair. Harlem continued its rhythm. Shops opened, numbers were collected, and the streets hummed with the same life as before, but beneath the surface, the landscape had shifted. Bumpy had proven that true power is measured not by visibility or force, but by intelligence, foresight, and the ability to manipulate events while remaining unseen. His actions over those 7 days were a masterclass in psychological dominance, a demonstration that understanding human behavior and anticipating moves before they occur is far more lethal than any weapon. The lesson extended beyond those who had directly opposed him. It permeated the neighborhood, teaching operators, allies, and even rivals that underestimating him was a fatal mistake. In the end, Bumpy Johnson reinforced his legacy not through violence alone, but through a strategy that combined patience, observation, and precise execution. 7 days had tested every facet of his intellect and influence, and the outcome was unequivocal. He had maintained control, neutralized threats, and secured respect through methodical mastery. For Harlem, the events were subtle yet profound. The blackmailer's failure became a cautionary tale whispered in alleys and behind closed doors, a reminder that in the world Bumpy ruled, the mind was the deadliest weapon. Even decades later, those who study the underworld recognize that few men could command a city not through chaos, but through calculated patience, timing, and strategic insight. Bumpy Johnson's actions during this week were not merely a response to a threat. They were a demonstration of his enduring genius, a blueprint for control, and a testament to the power of observation over impulse, intellect over intimidation. Harlem survived unscathed, but those who dared challenge him were forever altered, and the unspoken truth remained. Bumpy Johnson could be tested, but never beaten, and the streets remembered that silently, insistently, and permanently.